Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about nature, from fungi to plants and animals, and parks and natural areas around New York City, with my guest, Ryan Mandlebaum. He is a science writer, naturalist, and educator. He has written about the natural world for the New York Times, Scientific American, Gizmodo, Audubon Magazine, Gothamist, and their newsletter, EYY, I'm Walking Here. He volunteers for the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas, the organization formerly known as New York City Audubon, the Finch Research Network, and the Feminist Bird Club. He also works with IBM as a physics writer, and he has authored the book Wild NYC, Experience the Amazing Nature in and Around New York City. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Nancy. Thank you for having me.
I am so thrilled to have had this book, the experience of reading about so many plants and animals and the history of the land and the ecosystems in the New York City area. You don't have to be there. I felt I was there when I was reading your work. Your pictures are gorgeous. And of course, you also have lovely illustrations from your illustrator, Chelsea Beck. You talk about so much and write so beautifully about the nature that one can go and enjoy when we get outdoors. Let's begin with the history of the ecosystems in New York City, because most people think of it as just a land of skyscrapers, but you point out that there are lots of native species there, as well as some invasive species that one can enjoy too.
That's right. New York City is at a very privileged place when it comes to wildlife. It straddles two different climate zones. It's an estuary, meaning it's a place where fresh water interacts with salt water, and it simultaneously has some of the oldest and youngest rock you can find. And so because of that, altogether it has this just abundance of different ecosystems, and it would have had more, obviously, before it became a city. It had grasslands and marshes and forests and all sorts of incredible places to see wildlife. Now, of course, there were humans here as well for the past pretty much millennia. There were indigenous people here, and they would alter the land and set fires for farming, things like that. And the result is that for a very long time, humans have lived among quite a lot of biodiversity here in the city. And then, even today, a lot of those things are still true, despite the fact that the city's been totally transformed since colonization. And the result is that it's a place where we can still see thousands of species of plants and insects and hundreds of species of birds and dozens of species of mammals. So that was something I was really trying to capture in this book, is that I think it's still a place where humans and wildlife can live, maybe not in harmony, but at least live among each other.
You can just open up any page in the book, see a gorgeous picture, and then you describe it. You describe their behavior, their mating patterns for animals. You describe how they survive and whether or not they are native or invasive. And you point out that we can enjoy some of the introduced species as well, hoping that those species do not harm the native species. You have over 100 species in the book, but there are literally thousands of species in your area, including the insects, and the pictures of those are gorgeous. People shouldn't be afraid of looking at them or be afraid of their harming them. They are part of the natural ecosystem.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not really biased when it comes to the kinds of things I enjoy outside. And if you look at New Yorkers, feeding a pigeon is not such a weird thing to do. It's almost like a pastime. But now pigeons are actually introduced species. They're all descended from escaped pets brought over by Europeans. So one of the things I wanted to make sure people knew is that when it comes to invasive species, they're part of the ecosystem as well. And while you don't have to like them, you at least have to understand their potential, if sometimes cause benefit and also cause harm, and realize that, for example, if you feed a rat poison, that a native hawk, for example, might eat that rat and get sick. And also, when you're walking around New York City, the stuff that you see includes invasive species, and of course, it includes a lot of beautiful insects.
People think, when they think of animals, of the birds or the mammals. Of course, the birds, there are many native species that still use the wetlands and can be seen, whether or not they are there all year round or they migrate to and from the location. There are also the introduced species. Can you tell us about a few of the birds? Because I enjoyed looking at the pictures of the owls. One has to be very careful not to disturb them and sometimes go out at night to enjoy them.
Yeah, New York is a very important place for birds, surprisingly. Given all I was saying before about how biodiverse it is, a lot of migratory birds have been stopping in New York City to, let's say, refuel on their journeys northward and south for a very long time. And so even in Central Park, right, it's in the center of Manhattan, and yet bird watchers on a given day might see 100 species of different bird in Central Park, and that includes migratory warblers and tanagers and hawks and all sorts of things. And of course, you bring up owls. Now, in New York, it's a little harder to see owls. They're mainly in some of our outer borough natural areas, but there are owls that breed here. I mean, great horned owl is a big, beautiful owl that breeds all throughout the city. And then, of course, sometimes an owl will show up in a park like Central Park and become a social media celebrity. So a lot of people may remember Barry the barred owl, who lived here for a bit. And then also Flaco, who was an escaped zoo animal who lived in Central Park and became a social media celebrity. So owls definitely have the ability to draw a huge crowd, and a lot of people really like them.
You point out the problem of cities and birds and the lights of the city, and that's a problem all over the country, as well as the glass windows. What can or should be done to protect the birds from that kind of pollution and danger?
Yeah, so here in New York City, we have organizations that are committed to treating the city like wildlife habitat, kind of how I talk about in the book. You point out some of the major threats to animals that come here. The first is our light. If you put a big, giant city full of light in the middle of a natural area, a lot of animals use the night sky or the moon to orient themselves, and they can become disoriented in a bright city. And in fact, birds will sometimes be attracted to lights much in the same way that moths are. And of course, there's plenty of insects that are attracted to lights as well. What some of these organizations are doing is, first off, trying to pass laws that will help maybe have some of the lights turned off. Of course, it's a waste of energy sometimes to have all these lights turned on at night anyway. And then the other one is actually the New York City Bird Alliance, is an organization that I work for occasionally, is working to pass laws that make the glass on our buildings safe for bird collisions. This usually means stickers or etchings, but we actually do have a law in New York City that new constructions do need to have some amount of bird-safe glass to help stem the amount of bird deaths in collisions.
You mentioned Central Park, and a lot of people think that that's the largest park in New York City, but you say it isn't. A lot of the other parks have other kinds of natural features, as well as some buildings made by humans, as well as introduced species from people from European colonists who settled there. Your section in your book about taking the nature walks in these various parks is delightful, because you tell people to stay on the path or where to go and what they might watch and see. What is the biggest park?
The biggest park in New York City is surprisingly Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx, which I believe is around 3 times the size of Central Park. Now, it's a bit out of the way, but you can take public transit there, and all throughout the book, I ensure that the field trips that I feature are accessible by public transit. And it's quite an amazing park because, like you said, it formerly was land that part of it would have been estate, but also part of it is filled land built atop maybe dredging material or other just stuff that humans put there. And then altogether, it's a place that features big, beautiful forests, marshes, and wetlands, of course, and beaches, and it's quite a nice place to take a tour around. And there's a couple of surprises specifically in that field trip that I talk about that maybe I'll leave as a surprise for the reader. But let's just say that if you end up taking a hike around Pelham Bay Park and go towards the water, look at the rocks and see what you can find, because there are quite some incredible rocks.
There was a surprise for me. Every page about every feature, every plant, every animal. I was actually enthralled by reading about some species that aren't considered plants or animals, fungi and lichen. You describe describe the different kinds of species that one might see, but you also warn people, don't eat those mushrooms unless you really know what you're doing.
That's right. Both fungi and lichen have some very interesting stories that are tied to the city. Let's start with fungi. Is that there's a society devoted to their study here in New York City called the New York Mycological Society, which was actually founded by the composer John Cage, very, very well-known experimental composer. The result is that the club rules can occasionally read as being a little anarchist, but today they actually do quite a lot of amazing work in the city to educate people on the fungi that live here. They lead regular programming like tours through the parks, look at the mushrooms. They even offer microscopes and DNA sequencing kits to help you identify the mushrooms. And of course, I stress in the book that if you find something that you think is edible, you probably should make sure you know what it is before you eat it. And then with the added thing that here in New York City, you never know what may have urinated or been sprayed on the plant before you eat it. So that's fungi. And the lichen are also just have such an amazing story here in the city because New York was actually quite a bit more polluted halfway through the 20th century than it is today. So because of that, lichen are actually extremely sensitive to air pollution. It's quite hard for them to survive in a place that's polluted. So today, there's quite a bit more lichen than there was in the 1950s. And now the thing is that because of all of the human activity in New York City, even the species of lichen that we find are different today than they would have been back then.
One aspect of human activity is how to handle their waste. And unfortunately, people often just threw garbage into dumps, became landfills. Some of those landfills have been closed, new topsoil has been introduced, and then the issue is what kind of ecosystem do you restore it to? How is that decision made? Because I know at one time you talk about one New York commissioner who tried to create some parks, but it's always a problem when you try to restore an area. Do you make it a forest? Do you make it a grassland? Do you make it a marsh? Can you describe that process of change of the ecosystems and of the land and how that influences what species survive there?
Yeah, so it's a hard decision to decide what you're going to plant where, but New York, because much of the city, it's been altered so much by humans that we end up with these big landfills and we end up with parks that look different than they used to, but the city does offer guidelines to help restore basically to what the forest would have been there before, and it's usually determined by the kind of soil as well. And ultimately, we restore to certain kinds of ecosystems, right? We try and make parts of the city look the way that it did before the alteration happened. So the Parks Department is usually selecting plants that are both able to survive, but then also plants that will help be a part of that ecosystem. So you might have a swamp where it's mostly red maple, or you might have a forest on top of a hill that's oak and hickory. And then by planting those forests, what usually happens is, of course, there's intensive management. You have to make sure the invasive species are kept out if there's an especially aggressive one. And then birds will usually refine the forest. But I did want to focus on the landfills because that's a really interesting thing that we have here. We have tons of construction, and as part of construction, there's dredging and lots of dirt is uncovered and dumped somewhere else. And so there's a lot of new land that's created by the city when they're doing these really big construction projects. And then more recently, a lot of trash. This city used to have these enormous landfills. You have to then figure out what kind of stuff will grow in that soil and grow on these new landfills. And so a lot of it is experimentation to figure out what will hold, and you end up creating these new kinds of environments that maybe never existed before. On Governor's Island, for example, there are areas that assemblages of common plants that probably wouldn't exist anywhere else but they exist like that here in New York City because of our landfills.
It makes a difference what time of year you go out, what you might see in terms of the flowering plants?
In fact, as the year goes on, we see lots of changes as the seasons go. So there's some plants, some flowers that you see most in the fall. There's flowers that are best to see before the tree canopy leaves out. And then even the kinds of birds that you see would change as the year goes on because of their migration.
In your book, you describe the difference between a crow and a raven. You describe the difference between some of the native species and the species that have been brought over from other continents. Is there a movement to get rid of all those non-native species?
There are efforts to remove non-native species where they are a threat. So, of course, in some of our parks, we make sure to pull out some of those introduced plants that are very aggressive, like pokeweed is a good example of that, or multiflora rose. And then there are other places or other instances where the species are so well established that they end up just being part of the ecosystem.
You describe the naming of the plants and animals, and they're not always accurate. Real scientists and naturalists use the scientific name. Some of the common names are quite confusing. They don't actually tell us the truth, do they?
There are some birds that are quite poorly named, especially the red-bellied woodpecker is the most famous example, because you do have to be holding one in your hand to get a good look at the red belly. They have more of a red cap, but a red-headed woodpecker was already taken.
You mentioned some of the geologic formations. Where can one see best the ancient geologic formations on which the city has been built?
There's a couple places where you can see some of New York's really old bedrock. Most famous is simply just some of the exposed rock in Central Park is some of the oldest. Some of that rock is about 1 billion years old. And then in the Harlem River, so the northern tip of Manhattan, there is a big cliff face with the Fordham Gneiss Formation, which is another over billion-year-old rock formation, and there's a giant blue Columbia University sea painted on it. So if you end up there and see the giant blue sea, that is painted atop some really old bedrock.
You described so many beautiful places, beautiful animals and plants that one can enjoy. We are going to find out more about the amazing natural aspects of New York City when we return with my guest, Ryan Mandlebaum, who is author of Wild NYC, Experience the Amazing Nature in and Around New York City. We'll be back in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Ryan Mandlebaum, a science writer, naturalist, and educator. Every time I open a different page of your beautiful, stunning book, Wild NYC, Experience the Amazing Nature in and Around New York City, I learn something new, even about species that I may think I already know about. Because New York City is there on land, next to the water, the river, the ocean, you also mentioned the water birds. You talk about the whales, the turtles, fish, other animals that use both land and water. What are some of the species that one can enjoy and easily see, and what are the ones that are rather elusive?
So in terms of fish, of course, there's water that we interact with very often when we go outside. There's our Central Park, Prospect Park, and those have a mix of native fish like sunfish, fish that might have been stocked that are native like bass, and then introduced fish like carp. And those are fish that the city allows people to go fishing, and there's definitely fish to see. But then when you go to the shore and the beach, there's lots of really interesting stuff that you can see too. I mean, sometimes it's dead stuff that washes up on the beach. A very common thing we see wash up is dusky smoothhound, which is a small shark. It doesn't have pointy teeth, so it's not a problem. If you see one alive, it's not going to hurt you, but we definitely see dusky smoothhounds around, and then even skate, so you might imagine like a ray. We see them pretty frequently. Sometimes they get pulled up by the fishermen, and I'll sometimes even stand next to a fisherman just to see what they pull up here in the city. But then as you get out to the water, even from our beaches, we can see some pretty incredible sea life. Humpback whales, which is a relatively new thing to see commonly in the city, but there's an organization called Gotham Whale that studies them and tracks them and keeps track of the individuals, and you can go see them. There are boat rides that go offshore, not so far to see them, and some days you can even catch them. They're south from the beach on the Rockaways, kind of in the outer boroughs. Dolphins are a totally regular occurrence in the summer, and if you just look at the water, you'll eventually catch a dolphin's fin as they swim by. But even as you get far out offshore, and this is something that I feature in the book that's not quite New York City, but it's inspired by New York City, which is at the Hudson River, which is our kind of main river thoroughfare in New York City. It's a big, long river that starts in upstate New York and empties out in the city. It actually carved a canyon that goes far offshore, probably begins around 100 miles offshore, and it's this really steep-sided deep-sea canyon. Today, deep-sea canyons are often places of quite a lot of biodiversity and abundance, and it's because of their interaction with the sea, it ends up upwelling and bringing nutrients and stuff from the cold, deep water all the way up to the surface. There are boat trips you can take out there, and the kind of stuff you can see is really incredible. I mean, birds that are endangered go and hang out at the deep sea canyons. Puffins, like Atlantic puffins you'd see in Maine, we'll sometimes see in that canyon. All sorts of whales and dolphins and sea turtles, and it's quite an amazing experience that if you have the sea legs for it, the Gotham Whale folks, the American Princess Boat Tours is who runs them, and it's really amazing.
Along the beaches, you might find the crabs, and I loved how you talked about how the crabs use one of their big claws to attract the opposite sex. You also talk about about the common tern. Here in Southern California, where I am, we have a wetlands in Bolsa Chica that has a tern that's endangered. The problem with some of these animals is they nest on the very beaches that people like to go and enjoy. That is always a major problem, the interaction, how to protect these species. How many endangered species are there? Are almost all of these native species endangered, and particularly because you've got birds that have been introduced from elsewhere?
So there's quite a mix in the city. There actually are some threatened and endangered species that you can find breeding here. There is an endangered bird called the salt marsh sparrow. Salt marshes are a threatened habitat, especially because, first off, humans really like salt marshes as places to develop. And secondly, with climate change, we're starting to see our salt marshes get inundated by the rising sea. So that's one. There's also a threatened plant called sea beach amaranth. It's a really cute little plant. It almost looks like a succulent, but it has a pink stem. And we see it growing kind of in the late summer, but it's a plant that relies on the shifting nature of the beach to survive. And we often see it kind of on the outer part of the beaches, especially in the Rockaway Peninsula. And I feature it because it's this plant that actually really only lives between North Carolina and Massachusetts. So we're right in the middle of where this plant belongs. And it still manages to survive here in New York City, especially today with the interest in the piping plover. So the piping plover is a threatened species in New York, threatened in our area, especially because they like beaches and humans like beaches. And so we have to compete with the piping plovers when we go to the beach. But we've actually started to see that in places where we care about the piping plover and rope off parts of the beach for them to breed, it actually helps protect this endangered sea beach amaranth as well. So a cool place to see one of these ecosystem and interspecies interactions at play with some threatened species is just right here in New York City.
You talk about plants and which are necessary for the wetlands, whether or not they're common reeds or cord grasses or ferns. You talk about milkweed, which is so important for the monarch butterfly migration because they only feed on that species of plants. But you also show beautiful pictures in your book of other plants, of their leaves and their fruits. It's impossible for us to mention all of them. One of the species and pictures that you show, you don't even tell us where to find it. It's the tallest tree in the area.
That's right. The thing about New York City is that there's a lot of people, and it's a place where we do want to make sure that things can sort of stay safe. And if you bring too many people to a place, you always worry that it'll get overrun or trampled down. But indeed, I can even say it on your show, the tallest tree in New York City is called the Alley Pond Giant. It's in the far outer boroughs. It's quite a challenge to get to by public transit. It's a rather unassuming piece of the park that's kind of just a single trail through a shrubby-looking area overrun with quite a lot of invasive species. And then it's this tulip tree, which, if you can't tell, is in the book is one of my favorites. It's a very quick-growing native tree that grows straight up before it unleashes its leaves. Every part of it at some point looks like a tulip. The flowers look like tulips. The leaves look like tulips. Even the seeds look like tulips. Fabulous tree for native birds. So we see Baltimore Orioles in it. Hummingbirds like it. Tanagers like it. It's just a really amazing tree. But yes, they grow very tall. And so this tree is over 120 feet tall, which, of course, on the West Coast, you've got quite some giants. But on the East Coast, 120 feet is pretty big. Quite an amazing thing to see and stand at the bottom. And I think the most amazing thing about this tree to me is that it's very old. I think it's estimated at 350 years old. So that's a lot of time that this tree got to experience. New York has changed. So just being there and imagining kind of the people who saw this tree and the animals and birds that landed in this tree, it's quite a profound experience. So I have my best shot at taking a picture of the tree in the book, and then hope that folks who are a little more intrepid get a chance to take a look at it. So that's the Alley Pond Giant in Alley Pond Park, and you can find it online.
I am sure that every time you go out in nature, it's a wonderful discovery, even if it's an animal or plant that you've seen before. But in doing this book, did you have some unique discovery that really surprised you?
Bird watching is kind of the main entry point I had into nature watching. I go out quite a lot to go bird watching, and if we say that bird watching is part of my book preparation, then I have actually run into a couple of strange, out-of-the-way birds that you wouldn't normally expect to see in New York City. A West Coast bird called the black-throated gray warbler that I found in the park near my house was probably the weirdest find I've ever had. But when I used to just sit on my roof, and the main discovery that I made was just that even in kind of urban Brooklyn, I was seeing incredible diversity, and I was actually able to watch birds migrate. In early mornings, we finish finishing their migratory journey, and they would land in the parks and in the trees. And so I would stand on my roof and just count dozens of species of bird. And the most amazing thing that I would see is in late October, I would sometimes see these enormous flocks of American robins. The most I ever counted, I think, was 2,000 American robins just all flying over. That was quite a spectacle. And for me, the spectacles are always what I like the most. That's probably the most amazing thing that I discovered while I was doing the book.
You have beautiful photographs. You write so interestingly about the different species. I wish we had time to talk about all of them, because just looking at the colorful animals and plants, the insects, the invertebrates, we so often ignore them, and yet they are really marvelous critters that we need to have, because the birds and the mammals eat the insects, so we need to be careful about them and protect them, whether or not they're wasps or grasshoppers or bees or mantises or hornets or moths. And you show them, you show so much and talk about so much, but you do warn people about some of the animals that they might see in the city, and even to be sure to keep our domesticated cats indoors, because they kill a lot of the birds.
That's right. Readers will notice that I actually treat domestic cats as wildlife, because if they are living in the park and they are interacting with the animals that live there and the plants that live there, then to me they're wildlife. Humans are wildlife as well, but we don't have to get there. And I write about the ethical quandary with outdoor cats, because I totally understand that outdoor cats are very popular and people love their cats and take care of them. But of course, cats are incredible predators, and they're responsible for quite a lot of our native animals, our native birds, some of our native mammals. Cats can be quite a threat to them, and so the book does sort of ask people to consider whether a cat needs to be outside. I have a cat. She lives inside, and she seems to be very happy about it. But yes, like you said, these are one of the threats that people need to think about, and I try not to come down too hard, but I do want to make sure that I lay out some of the ethical quandaries that naturalists living in New York City might have to think about as they're walking around.
It's so great that you are encouraging people to go out, and this isn't an ordinary kind of guidebook. You explain what people might encounter and what they are and what they do, and you also make it easy for people to go out, or they can just stay at home and read the beautiful book, but you want them to get outdoors, and you point out that even walking out on the sidewalk, they might find something.
Yeah, that is true. You talk about insects. I am a lover of moths. Moths are one of the real underrated of our insects, because people think of them as just being kind of little brown things that eat your clothes. But in fact, that's just one species of moth, and there's over 150,000 different species of moths. Many of them are some of the most beautiful animals you've ever seen. Luna moth is kind of one that a lot of people have seen, and they're rare in New York City, but they're one you can see. And then there's some of the most intricately patterned moths you'll ever see, and some of them have extremely interesting stories, and I did try and capture that, but one of my favorite moths I saw ever in my life came to the roof of my house one night.
Your stories, your photographs, the information is so wonderful. It's incredible reading your book, Wild NYC: Experience the Amazing Nature in and Around New York City. I wish we had time to talk about more. You'll have to come back and tell us about the glaciers in New York City. You have to tell us about the indigenous people, because you often give the indigenous names to some of these species. You talk about the European colonization and how that's affected nature with the introduced species. You've talked about the natural areas, and you've talked about the native species that have survived. It's a wonderful book to learn more about nature, about animals and plants. Thank you so very much for making this available to us, for sharing your love of nature. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm always willing to talk about the nature and the wildlife of New York City. And my book is Wild NYC. My website is ryanfmandlebaum.com, and you can see more of my writing there. But I hope that you all enjoy the book. I'm really excited about it. Just thank you so much, everybody.
Absolutely. Go to the website, which is www.ryanfmandlebaum.com, ryanfmandlebaum.com. The book is from Timber Press. We'll have to have you back to talk about some of the other hundreds of species that you described.
Yeah, if people enjoy the show, I'm happy to come back, because I'm always down to talk about nature.
Thank you. I have been speaking with Ryan Mandlebaum, who is a science writer, naturalist, and educator, who has written for many publications. He also volunteers for the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas, the Finch Research Research Network and the Feminist Bird Club. And he is author of Wild NYC, Experience the Amazing Nature in and Around New York City. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.